The dust tasted of shame. It coated Ilara's tongue, a gritty film of everything she had lost. It clung to the hem of her worn calico dress, the same one she had mended just a week ago, her needle-pricked fingers still tender, a phantom ache of a life that was no longer hers. The sun was a merciless hammer in the vast indifferent sky, beating down on her bowed head as the town of redemption watched. They stood in a silent, accusing half-circle, their faces a blur of pious judgment and morbid curiosity. Her husband's family, the Abernethys, were at the forefront, their expressions carved from stone and satisfaction. It was Jed, her brother-in-law, whose voice had been the whip that flayed her spirit raw. "A barren field yields no crop," he had declared in the dusty street, his voice ringing with the authority of a man who had just inherited everything. "The Lord has seen fit to close her womb, and so we close our door." The words echoed. The town doctor's solemn pronouncement months ago. A death sentence delivered with a sympathetic tilt of the head. Barren. The word was a brand on her soul, hotter than the sun on her neck. They had taken the farm, the one she and Thomas had poured their sweat and dreams into. They had taken the quilt her own mother had stitched, the rocking chair Thomas had carved, even the small wooden bird he'd whittled for a child that never came. They left her with a small burlap sack containing a loaf of stale bread, a tarnished silver locket with her parents' likenesses, and the clothes on her back. She was an outcast, a vessel deemed unworthy, a ghost to be exorcised from the memory of a prosperous family. She hadn't cried. The tears were a frozen stone in her chest, too heavy to rise. She had simply walked, her feet moving with a numb, mechanical rhythm, away from the pointing fingers and the hushed venomous whispers. She walked until the town was a smudge on the horizon, and the only sound was the rasp of her own breathing. She followed the creek, its gentle murmur a stark contrast to the screaming silence in her head. The water flowed, uncaring, over smooth gray stones, a constant cleansing movement that felt like a mockery of her own stagnation. Her legs finally gave out where the willows wept over the bank, their long green tendrils trailing in the current like a woman's hair. She collapsed onto the damp earth, the coolness a small fleeting mercy against her feverish skin. The burlap sack fell beside her, the bread rolling out and into the dirt. She didn't even have the strength to retrieve it. Hunger, a dull, familiar ache, gnawed at her belly, but it was a distant pain, overshadowed by the gaping wound in her spirit. She was nothing. A wife without a husband, a woman without a child, a farmer without land, a soul without an anchor. She curled into a tight ball, her forehead pressed against the cool, damp soil, and for the first time, a sound escaped her lips. It was not a cry, but a dry, ragged sob that tore from the depths of her emptiness. She was a shipwrecked on a shore of her own failure. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and bruised purple, the colors of a fading hope. She closed her eyes, the image of Thomas's kind face swimming in the darkness behind her lids. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the dirt, to his memory, to the God who had forsaken her. "I'm so sorry I wasn't enough." A shadow fell over her, long and stark in the fading light. She didn't move, didn't look up. It was probably a coyote, or perhaps death itself, come to claim the husk she'd become. It didn't matter. Let it come. Let it end. But the shadow remained, silent and still. Then, a voice low and rough like stones grinding together, cut through the evening air. "You plannin' on dying here?" The voice belonged to a man who looked as though he'd been carved from the harsh landscape itself. Silas Blackwood was a name whispered in redemption with a mixture of fear and pity. A rancher from the high country, a man who kept to himself since his own tragedy had hollowed him out years ago. Ilara had seen him in town only a handful of times, a tall, broad-shouldered figure who moved with a heavy, deliberate gait, his face a mask of grim endurance. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were shadowed by the brim of a sweat-stained hat. They held a profound, aching loneliness she recognized, for it was a mirror to her own. He had lost his wife and infant son to a fever that had swept through the valley 3 winters past. He had buried them himself on a hill overlooking his ranch, and a part of him had been buried with them. Now he stood over her, his presence, a solid, unmovable thing against the twilight. Ilara slowly pushed herself up, her limbs trembling with exhaustion. She looked at him, her own eyes dry and burning, her face smudged with dirt and despair. She didn't have the energy for pretense. "What if I am?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. He didn't flinch. His gaze was direct, unflinching, stripping away the layers of her public humiliation and seeing the raw, bleeding wound beneath. He saw not the barren widow, but the survivor. "It's a poor spot for it," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Coyotes'll get you before the night's out. They won't leave much for a decent burial." The bluntness of his words was a shock, a splash of icy water that jolted her from her stupor. He wasn't offering pity. He was offering a stark, brutal truth. He gestured with his chin toward the town. Heard what the Abernathys did, heard what they said. He didn't need to elaborate. In a town as small as Redemption, secrets were a currency, and her shame was the talk of every supper table. "They're fools," he stated simply, not as a comfort, but as a fact. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her small, frail form, the torn dress, the bare feet. He saw the strength that had carried her this far, the stubborn flicker of life that refused to be extinguished. And in that moment, he saw a solution to a problem of his own. His ranch was failing. The work was too much for one man, and the loneliness was a cancer, eating him from the inside out. He needed help. He needed a reason to get up when the sun rose. He needed a life to anchor him to the world of the living. He looked at the setting sun, then back at her. The silence stretched, filled only by the murmur of the creek and the frantic beating of Ilara's own heart. She expected him to turn and walk away, to leave her to her fate. Instead, he made a proposition that would shatter the world she knew, and rebuild it into something she could never have imagined. "I need a wife," he said, his voice devoid of any romance, any tenderness. It was a statement of need, as raw and honest as the land he worked. "My house is empty. My fields are fallow. I can't do it alone anymore." Ilara stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. A wife? He was proposing marriage? To her? The barren outcast? I can't give you children," she stammered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It was the first thing she had to offer, the truth of her brokenness. Silas's expression didn't change. A flicker of pain, so quick she almost missed. It crossed his eyes. "I've had a child," he said, his voice softer now, laced with a grief that was still raw. "The Lord gave, and the Lord took away. I'm not a skin for heirs. I'm a skin for a partner, someone to share the work, someone to sit across the table from, that's all." He extended a hand to her. It was large, calloused, and scarred, the hand of a man who knew nothing but hard labor. It was not a hand offering salvation, but a hand offering a bargain, a pact between two broken souls. "I can offer you a roof over your head," he said, "food in your belly. My name, it's not much, but it's more than this creek bed." Ilara looked at his outstretched hand, then at the darkness gathering around her. She could stay here and let the night consume her, or she could take the hand of this stranger, this fellow ghost, and step into an unknown future. It was a choice between a certain death and a terrifying life. She thought of the Abernathy's smug faces, of the whispers that would follow her, no matter where she went. Marrying Silas Blackwood would be a scandal, a grieving widower and a barren widow. The town would feast on it. But in that moment, she found a spark of defiance she thought had died. Let them talk. Her dignity had already been stripped from her. What more could she lose? She placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, solid, real. It was the first human touch she had felt in days that wasn't a push or a shove. It was an anchor. "All right," she whispered, the word of fragile promise in the twilight. "I'll be your wife." The journey to his ranch was a silent one, made on the back of his sturdy gray mare. Elara sat behind him, her hands resting hesitantly on his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his rough spun shirt. The landscape grew wilder, the gentle hills giving way to rugged pine-clad mountains that clawed at the darkening sky. The air grew colder, cleaner, scented with pine and damp earth. It was a world away from the manicured fields and neat little houses of redemption. Silas's ranch was nestled in a high valley, a small, lonely island in a sea of wilderness. The cabin was a dark shape against the star-dusted sky, a single plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. It was not a home, it was a shelter. Inside, it was stark and masculine, smelling of wood smoke, leather, and loneliness. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long dancing shadows on the rough-hewn log walls. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A narrow bed was tucked into one corner, a patchwork quilt, faded and worn, its only comfort. It was the quilt his wife, Mary, had made. Elara's heart ached at the sight of it. She was an intruder in this house of ghosts. Silas didn't seem to notice her hesitation. He moved with a weary familiarity, ladling stew from a pot hanging over the fire into 2 wooden bowls. He placed them on the table, along with a loaf of dark bread. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clinking of their spoons against the wood and the crackle of the fire. The stew was thick and savory, filled with meat and root vegetables. It was the first real meal Elara had eaten in days, and the warmth spread through her, a small comfort in the vast emptiness of her new life. After they ate, Silas gestured. "To the bed. You take the bed," he said. "I'll take the floor by the fire." There was no room for argument in his tone. He spread a bearskin rug on the hearth and lay down, his back to her. Elara, exhausted to her bones, slipped under the quilt. It smelled faintly of lavender and of a woman she would never know. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of Silas's steady breathing and the lonely cry of a wolf in the cove. Distant mountains. She was married. She had a home. But she had never felt more alone. The days that followed were a blur of hard, relentless work. There was no honeymoon, no period of adjustment. There was only survival. The ranch was in a state of neglect, a testament to a man overwhelmed by grief. Fences were down, the barn roof leaked, and the fields were choked with weeds. Elara, who had grown up on a farm, knew what needed to be done. She rose before the sun, her body aching, and set to work. She mucked out the chicken coop, her hands raw and blistered. She patched the barn roof with Silas, the 2 of them working in a synchronized, unspoken rhythm, passing shingles and nails back and forth. She learned to milk their one scrawny cow, her hands clumsy at first, but growing more confident with each passing day. She scrubbed the cabin from top to bottom, chasing away the ghosts of neglect and sorrow. She washed the windows until they sparkled, letting the sunlight stream into the dark corners. She aired out Mary's quilt, the scent of lavender fading, replaced by the clean smell of sunshine and wind. She was not trying to erase the memory of the woman who had come before her. She was simply trying to make a space for herself. Silas worked alongside her, his silence a constant, brooding presence. He was a man of few words, his emotions locked away behind a wall of stoic endurance. He never thanked her, never praised her. But she would see him watching her, his stormy eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and something else she couldn't quite name, a grudging respect perhaps. He taught her to shoot, his large hands guiding hers as she held the heavy rifle. "You need to know how to protect yourself when I'm not here," was all he said. He taught her to track, to read the signs of the forest, the subtle language of the wilderness. He showed her which plants were for eating and which were for medicine. He was a part of this wild land, and he was slowly, silently, making her a part of it too. There were moments of clumsy tenderness, small fleeting gestures that hinted at the humanity buried beneath their shared pain. One evening, as she was mending one of his shirts by the firelight, her fingers stiff with cold, he got up without a word and draped a warm blanket over her shoulders. Another time when she cut her hand on a piece of broken glass, he cleaned and bandaged it with a surprising gentleness, his rough fingers surprisingly deft. They never spoke of these moments. They were like fragile blossoms, too delicate to survive the harsh climate of their reality. They were two people clinging to a life raft in a sea of sorrow, their survival dependent on a fragile, unspoken truce. The nights were the hardest. They slept in the same room, separated by a few feet of cold, empty space. The intimacy of their shared darkness was a constant reminder of the chasm that separated them. Alara would lie in the bed, listening to the sound of his breathing, her body aching for a comfort she couldn't ask for. She would sometimes hear him cry out in his sleep, a single anguished word, "Mary," and her own heart would break. For him, for his loss, for her own. One day, a month into their strange marriage, they ran out of flour. The trip to redemption was unavoidable. The thought of facing the town filled Alara with a cold dread. She was no longer the pitiful outcast. She was Silas Blackwood's wife. But she knew the whispers would be just as cruel, just as cutting. As they rode into town, she could feel the eyes on them, the curtains twitching in the windows, the conversations that stopped as they passed. She kept her head high, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the space between her horse's ears. Silas rode beside her, his face a granite mask, daring anyone to challenge them. Their first stop was the general store. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, greeted them with a genuine warmth that was a balm to Ilara's frayed nerves. "Ilara, Silas, good to see you both," she said, her smile including them both, as if their marriage was the most natural thing in the world. As Ilara gave her the list, Jed Abernathy walked in, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. His eyes, small and mean, landed on Ilara, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look what the cat dragged in. The barren widow, playing house with the grieving fool. Tell me, Blackwood, does she keep your bed warm at night? Or is she as cold and empty as her womb?" The air crackled with tension. Ilara froze, the blood draining from her face. She could feel the familiar sting of shame, the urge to run, to hide. But then she felt Silas move beside her. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body. He was a mountain, immovable and formidable. He looked at Jed, his stormy eyes blazing with a cold, quiet fury that was more terrifying than any shouted threat. "You say another word about my wife," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "and I will break you." Jed, for all his bluster, was a coward. He paled under Silas's glare, took a step back, and then scurried out of the store like the rat he was. The silence he left behind was thick with unspoken admiration. Mrs. Gable quietly finished packing their supplies, her movements gentle and deliberate. As she handed the sack to Silas, she looked at Ilara, her eyes filled with a newfound respect. "You've got a good man there, Ilara," she whispered. On the ride back to the ranch, the silence between them was different. It was no longer a chasm of loneliness, but a space filled with a new, fragile understanding. As they neared the ranch, Ilara reached out and placed a hand on Silas's arm. He stopped the horse, turning to look at her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He simply nodded, but in his eyes she saw a flicker of something she had never seen before. A connection. A bond forged in the fire of public humiliation. That night, As they sat by the fire, Silas spoke, his voice quiet in the stillness of the cabin. "Mary, she wanted a big family," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "She loved children. She would have been a wonderful mother." It was the first time he had ever spoken of his wife in more than just a name. Ilara's heart ached for him. "I'm sorry," she said, the words inadequate, but all she had to offer. He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded pain. "It wasn't your fault," he said. "It wasn't mine. It was just life." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It was an acknowledgement of their shared grief, their shared survival. It was a bridge across the chasm that had separated them. That night, Ilara did not feel alone. She was part of something. A broken, fragile, but real thing. A family of two, clinging to each other in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The small act of defiance in the general store had an unexpected ripple effect. While the Abernathys and their cronies continued to spew their venom, a quiet shift began to occur in redemption. People started to see them not as a scandal, but as a story of survival. Mrs. Gable began saving scraps of fabric for Ilara, small, colorful pieces for a quilt she had started. The blacksmith, a gruff man named Ben, offered Silas a fair price for his timber. Small gestures, but they were lifelines, threads of connection to a community that had once cast them out. One Sunday, as they were leaving the store, they found a basket on their wagon. Inside was a freshly baked apple pie and a jar of honey, with a simple note, "Welcome to the valley." There was no name. It was an anonymous act of kindness, a silent show of support that brought tears to Ilara's eyes. She was no longer just the barren widow. She was Ilara Blackwood, a woman of strength and dignity. And Silas was no longer the grieving fool. He was a man who had stood up for his wife. Their marriage, born of desperation and convenience, was slowly, imperceptibly, transforming into something more. The silences between them were no longer empty, but filled with a comfortable companionship. They learned to read each other's moods, to anticipate each other's needs. A shared smile over a cup of coffee in the morning, a lingering touch as they passed in the narrow cabin, a quiet moment watching the sunset from the porch. These were the small, precious bricks with which they were building a new life. One evening, a fierce storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised, angry purple. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows and tearing at the roof. The rain came down in sheets, turning the dry earth into a sea of mud. They worked together, securing the animals, reinforcing the windows, their movements a seamless dance of practiced efficiency. As the storm raged outside, they sat by the fire, the only light in the dark, tumultuous world. The fear that had once been a constant companion was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. They were safe, they were together. In a moment of impulse, Ilara reached out and took Silas's hand. He didn't pull away. He laced his fingers with hers, his grip firm and reassuring. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the storm, their shared warmth a bulwark against the chaos outside. "I was so scared," Ilara whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "When the Abernathys threw me out, I thought my life was over." Silas squeezed her hand. "It wasn't over," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It was just beginning." And in that moment, under the shelter of their small, sturdy cabin, with the storm raging around them, Ilara knew he was right. This was not the end, it was a new beginning, a life forged in the crucible of pain and loss, a love story written not in flowery words, but in shared labor, quiet companionship, and the silent, unwavering strength of two broken souls who had found a way to heal each other. The winter was harsh, a relentless siege of snow and ice that locked them in their high valley. But for the first time, the isolation didn't feel like a prison. The cabin, once a symbol of loneliness, became a sanctuary of warmth and shared intimacy. The long, dark evenings were spent by the fire, Ilara sewing, Silas carving small, intricate animals from scraps of wood. He had a surprising talent for it, his large, rough hands creating delicate, lifelike figures. He carved her a bird, its wings outstretched in flight, a silent acknowledgement of the spirit he had seen in her, the one that had refused to be broken. The physical space between them in the small cabin had shrunk, and with it, the emotional distance. One night, awakened by a nightmare, Ilara cried out. Silas was there in an instant, his hand on her shoulder, his voice a low, soothing murmur in the darkness. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply sat with her until the trembling subsided, his presence a solid, comforting anchor in the stormy sea of her memories. The unspoken attraction that had simmered beneath the surface of their practical arrangement finally broke through. It happened one evening as they were cleaning up after supper. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same dish. A spark, as real and potent as a lightning strike, passed between them. They both froze, their eyes locking in the flickering firelight. The air grew thick with a tension that had nothing to do with hardship or survival. It was the raw, undeniable pull of a man and a woman. Silas slowly reached out and cupped her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. His touch was hesitant, questioning, as if he was afraid she might pull away. But Ilara leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. This was not the desperate bargain of two strangers. This was the culmination of months of shared struggle, of quiet understanding, of a love that had grown in the rocky soil there. Shared grief. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound tenderness. It was a kiss that spoke of shared sorrows and a dawning hope. It was a kiss that sealed their pact, transforming it from a marriage of convenience into a union of hearts. That night, for the first time, Silas did not sleep on the floor. He joined her in the bed, and in the warm, safe cocoon of Mary's quilt, they found a solace and a comfort they had both thought was lost to them forever. They made love with a slow, gentle reverence, a quiet exploration of bodies that had long been starved of touch. It was a healing, a reclamation of a part of themselves they had both thought was dead. In the aftermath, lying in each other's arms, Ilara traced the scars on his back, a roadmap of a life of hard labor and pain. "I love you, Silas Blackwood," she whispered into the darkness. He held her tighter, his voice thick with emotion when he finally answered. "And I love you, Ilara Blackwood." As the snows began to melt, a new life was stirring not just in the valley, but in Ilara herself. A life she had been told she could never have. The signs were subtle at first, a persistent fatigue, a strange queasiness in the mornings. She dismissed them as the lingering effects of the long winter. But when the signs persisted, a wild, impossible hope began to bloom in her heart. She didn't tell Silas. The hope was too fragile, too precious to be exposed to the harsh light of reality. What if she was wrong? The disappointment would be too much to bear. But one day, as she was hanging laundry, a wave of dizziness washed over her, and she had to sit down, her head spinning. Silas, who had been chopping wood nearby, saw her. He was by her side in an instant, his face etched with concern. "Ilara, are you all right?" She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and wonder. "Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling. I think I'm with child." The axe fell from his hand, clattering onto the ground. He stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "But the doctor was wrong," she said, a slow, radiant smile spreading across her face. He knelt before her, his large hands gently, reverently, touching her still flat belly. He looked up at her, his stormy eyes filled with tears. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply pulled her into his arms and held her, his body shaking with a joy so profound it was almost painful. The news of Alara's pregnancy spread through Redemption like a wildfire. It was a miracle, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a story that silenced the gossips and turned into awe. The Abernethys were conspicuously silent, their cruelty exposed for the lie it was. The community that had once shunned them now embraced them. A baby shower was held in the town hall, the room filled with gifts and well-wishes. Mrs. Gable gave them a handcrafted cradle. Ben, the blacksmith, forged a set of tiny iron animals. Even people who had once looked at them with scorn now offered their congratulations, their faces filled with a genuine, if grudging, respect. But their newfound happiness was to be short-lived. Jed Abernethy, consumed by a bitter, venomous jealousy, was not a man to accept defeat. He saw their joy as a personal affront, a mockery of his authority. He began to spread a new, more insidious rumor. The child, he claimed, could not be Silas's. It must be the product of an illicit affair. He used their unconventional marriage, their isolation, as proof. He poisoned the minds of the town council, preying on their fears and prejudices. He filed a legal claim, not just for the child, but for Silas's ranch. He argued that Silas, a man who had taken in a woman of loose morals, was an unfit guardian, an unstable presence in the community. He claimed that the land which had belonged to Mary's family should revert to him, her closest living relative. A hearing was set. The climax of their struggle was not to be a battle against the elements, but against the petty, vicious cruelty of a man who could not bear to see them happy. The day of the hearing, the town hall was packed. It felt like a trial, with Alara and Silas on one side, and Jed and his supporters on the other. Jed, smug and self-righteous, laid out his case, his words dripping with false piety and thinly veiled contempt. He painted Alara as a seductress, a woman of questionable character. He painted Silas as a fool, blinded by grief and lust. Alara felt the old shame creeping back, the familiar sting of public humiliation. But then she looked at Silas. He sat beside her, his hand holding hers, his face a calm, steady anchor in the storm of accusations. He was not afraid. He was ready to fight. When it was his turn to speak, Silas stood, his presence commanding the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not resort to insults. He simply told their story. He spoke of his grief, his loneliness, the darkness that had almost consumed him. He spoke of finding Alara by the creek, a broken woman on the verge of giving up. He spoke of her strength, her resilience, her quiet dignity. This woman, he said, his voice ringing with a fierce protective love, did not seduce me. She saved me. She brought light back into my life. She gave me a reason to live again. He looked at the faces of the town council, men he had known his whole life. You talk of morals, he said, his voice laced with a quiet contempt. Is it moral to cast out a grieving widow? Is it moral to strip a woman of her home, her dignity, her very will to live? That is what this man, he pointed a finger at Jed, did, and you stood by and watched. He turned to Alara, his eyes softening. This child, he said, his voice thick with emotion, is a gift, a miracle, a symbol of hope. It is a child of love, born not of convenience, but of a bond forged in the deepest fires of adversity. This is my wife. This is my child. And this is my home. And I will die before I let any man take them from me. A profound silence fell over the room. His words, simple and honest, had cut through the lies and the prejudice, exposing the truth in all its raw, powerful beauty. Just then, a commotion at the back of the hall drew everyone's attention. The town doctor, a man who had long been a pillar of the community, pushed his way to the front. His face was pale, his hands trembling. He looked at the council then. At Alara, his eyes filled with a deep, profound shame. I have a confession to make, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I made a mistake. He explained that he had recently received a letter from a colleague in a larger city, detailing a new understanding of female infertility. He had realized to his horror that his diagnosis of Alara had been based on outdated, incomplete knowledge. He had been wrong. There was nothing wrong with her. He had condemned her out of ignorance. The confession was a bombshell, shattering the last vestiges of Yet's credibility. The council, their faces a mixture of shock and shame, dismissed the case without a moment's hesitation. Jed Abernathy, exposed as a liar and a bully, slunk out of the town hall, his reputation in tatters. The crowd erupted in cheers. People surged forward, surrounding Silas and Alara, offering their apologies, their support, their admiration. They had been judged, tested, and found worthy. They had fought for their family, for their love, and they had won. As they walked out of the town hall into the bright, cleansing sunlight, Alara leaned her head on Silas's shoulder. They were no longer broken souls. They were whole. They were survivors. They were a family. Their son was born in the spring, in the same bed where their love had been consummated, with the scent of pine and apple blossoms drifting in through the open window. They named him Thomas, after the husband Alara had lost, and Daniel, after the son Silas had buried. He was a symbol of their past, their present, and their future. He had his father's stormy eyes and his mother's quiet strength. He was a child of the wilderness, born of a love that was as wild and resilient as the mountains that surrounded them. Their wedding was not a grand affair. It was a simple ceremony held on the porch of their cabin under the vast open sky. The entire town of Redemption was there, their faces no longer filled with judgment, but with a deep, abiding respect. Mrs. Gable stood as Alara's maid of honor, and Ben, the blacksmith, as Silas's best man. They exchanged simple, heartfelt vows, promises not of a perfect life, but of a shared one, a life of enduring love and unwavering partnership. As Silas slipped a simple gold band onto Alara's finger, he looked into her eyes, his own filled with a love so profound it took her breath away. "They were broken," whispered Mrs. Gable to her husband, tears streaming down her face. "Now they are whole." The ranch flourished. The fields were green and fertile, the barn was full, and the cabin, once a place of sorrow, was now filled with the sound of laughter. It was a home, built not just of logs and stone, but of love, forgiveness, and the enduring power of the human heart to heal. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the valley, Alara and Silas sat on the porch, their son sleeping peacefully in the cradle between them. Silas was carving another animal, a small, perfect replica of their son's tiny hand. Alara leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart full to bursting. She thought of the woman she had been, the broken, hopeless creature crying by the creek. She thought of the man who had found her, the grieving ghost who had offered her a lifeline. They had been two halves of a shattered whole, two lonely souls, who had found in each other the missing pieces of their hearts. They had faced judgment, hardship, and the very worst of human nature, and they had not only survived, they had triumphed. Silas put down his carving and took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. He didn't need to speak. The love that flowed between them was a language all its own. Alara looked out at the majestic, timeless mountains, at the endless sky, at the small, sturdy home they had built together. This was not a fairy tale. It was something far more real, far more precious. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most beautiful things are born from the deepest pain, that redemption can be found in the most unexpected of places, and that a family is not defined by blood, but by the unwavering choice to love, to fight, and to heal together. This, she thought, her heart overflowing with a quiet, profound gratitude. This is what it feels like to be home.